Hi everyone, welcome to Angular tutorial. So this is my first tutorial and today I'm going to tell you about Angular dynamic components, how we can create components dynamically and attach them to the body and how we can detach those components. And for the purpose of this tutorial, I will be using StackBlitz, which is an online editor, which is a free editor. And yeah, so here we can create code in Angular, React, all these things I'm going to do in Angular. So the moment I click on that, I get a Angular application out of the box, which has a basic component and a module and the configuration file. So for this dialog, we will be using primeng. So let me go ahead and install primeng as a dependency. Yep. So this will install the primeng 6. This installs the latest version. So now we have a primeng in there. So let us include the primeng dialog module into our application. So we're going to say import dialog module from primeng / primeng. This is the node modules folder path for the primeng, and that we are going to include in the imports so that we can access dialog in the application. And if you notice, these changes, they render immediately on the right hand side. So now our application is asking for Angular animations because primeng dialog box requires Angular animation. So we're gonna go ahead and install this. Yeah. So now it is installed. Now we have to include the animations into the application. So actually animations lies inside platform browser and animations. So the name is browser animation module, or we can give a new animation if you don't want to include that. We're gonna import this module as well. Okay, we are getting an error. Oh yeah, here an S is missing, so it's called as platform browser animations module. There we go. So we have it right now. Let us go ahead and create one dialog folder. So under this we will have one dialog component and corresponding HTML file. And in the HTML, let us render the pdialog. And let us make it always visible. Hi, this is from dialog. Okay, now we're going to create the component of dialog. So for that, first we will import the component class from Angular core. Now we're going to use the component decorator to design our component, and the basic need for a component is a selector. We will name it as dialog, and it has to be wrapped inside a class. We will name it as dialog component, Let us give a constructor, and for the time being let's just add a header for the dialog which is of type string, and for the time being I will hard code it. This is a header. Now that we have the header here, we can put it in this place. So PrimeNG dialog takes a p header. This particular template, if we give it, overrides a default header. Okay, so we have a basic dialog component. Let us include this component as one of the declarations in the map module so that we can use that. So I'm going to import that dialog component into our app module. The location would be dialog slash dialog.component. You need not append the TS file, that is by default understood. So it seems like we have done some mistake. No template specified. Okay, got it. So this particular selector, along with selector, template is also mandatory. So we can either give a template or a template URL. Since we have a different file, let us go with the template URL. And that would be dialog.component.html. Okay, there we go. It all built properly. Now let us try including the dialog component in here and see if it works. Okay, now we don't see these things, so let us copy some PrimeNG default style classes, so that we can have a look at this in a better way. Okay, I have copied the stylings, pasted this. These you can find it in the PrimeNG site itself. These are basic CSS style classes, style files what PrimeNG uses. Okay, now if we see the dialog is not showing up, the reason is there is some error. Let us see what is the error. We are getting an error that validate style property is not a function. I have run into this error earlier, so solution is to change the Angular animation version to 6.00 to match with other items. So I'm going to delete Angular animations and I'm going to install Angular animations 6.00. Okay, now we have Angular 6.00. Let us see. Yeah, now the error is gone. Okay, now we don't see any dialog. The reason being dialog is already a component. It's already, there is a selector in PrimeNG. So let's just rename it to, let's say, app-dialog. So I'm going to change the same in here. Okay, now we see the dialog by default and it's always present. So dialog appears, which is good. So we'll get rid of that. Now we will add one service file to this dialog.service.ts. So inside the service file, we'll import the injectable property from Angular core. By using this, we will make a service. We have to create a class which we by default export it. Let us call this class as dialog service. Now inside this, let us create a subject which is in our RxJS property class. This is from RxJS library, and Here RxJS is added by default. We are using 6.1.0 version. So we are going to make a dialog subject, which is a private variable, dialog subject, which is of type subject of any, which is equal to a new subject of any. Let us declare it and initialize it. Then we are going to create one subscriber for this dialog observable. Let us append dollar, which is a common practice to add a dollar to an observable, which is of type observable, which is again from RxJS. So we can include this as well into this. And observable should be of particular type. I'm just declaring it as n. Let us have a constructor, and in the constructor we are going to initialize this observable to from the subject dialog subject. We're going to make an observable. That is what we will consume throughout. So now we have an observable, we have a dialog. Let us create a create method, a public method, which will be used to open this pop-up. So we have a create method. So from here we have to instantiate the pop-up. So let us import the pop-up component, dialog component from dialog dot component. So we have the dialog component in here. Now from this component we have to get a component reference, that is by putting it through a component factory resolver. So we can declare a factory resolver which is available from the Angular core. Component fact resolver. Let me just give a short name for that. So now we have a component factory resolver. Let us proceed and create a component reference, which is equal to this dot comp reference component factory resolver dot resolve component factory. We are gonna give dialog component for that. Now we have to give an injector to this so that it creates the actual component. So in order to pass the injector, let us include the injector from Angular core. So we have the injector. Let us declare it over here so that dependency injection takes care of it and it gives us an injector. Now that we have an injector, we can pass this injector into this component factory resolver. So this would actually create the component and would give us the component reference of it. Now we have the reference. So now we need application reference to attach this view. Let us create a private variable called appRef, which is the application reference instance. So now we have the application reference. So we can simply say appRef dot attach view, which is nothing but component reference dot host view. We get a host view or the node of that, then we attach that to the application. So why we are doing this? The moment we attach this to the application reference, this particular component becomes a part of Angular tree. So any changes we make in this particular component, all are triggered, will be monitored by Angular. So any changes in the variable will be monitor by Angular, and the changes will be seen in the UI. Now we have to attach this content to the DOM so that it is visible. Let us go ahead and do that. To do that, we have to take the root node from this host view and attach that to the body. So let us take the root node from this. Okay, it's giving an array. So let us quickly convert this to acceptable type. So we'll convert this comp reference host view as a embedded view, which is again from the Angular core embedded view reference of type any, and this would be root nodes. And let us convert this nodes as an HTML element. Now we can attach it to the document's body. Yes. So now this will create a component using a component factor resolver. That is, now currently we are trying to create a dialog component, and we are creating the instance of it by passing the injector. So this component reference has an inject instance also, which actually gives you all the properties of this class. For example, this dialog component has a header property. We can access this header property immediately after this, or we can even call any methods of this component reference or this dialog component, that is by adding component reference dot instance. So now that we have, let us go ahead and test this. So in the app component, let us add a button, and we will call it open dialog. This will, let us give a click method for this, which we'll call it open dialog. Now we are going to declare this method in its component, and let it be of type public. Now we need a constructor to have dependency injection. Let us make a reference to the dialog service, and we are going to import this dialog service from respective path. And we have some errors here. Static injector error, app component dialog service. Okay, now we need to have the provider for this particular component. Let us add a providers array, which would take dialog service, and let us import this. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Now let us go ahead and call this method. So once user clicks on open dialog, we're going to call the create method from dialog. We have an error. Okay, now this dialog component is not an entry component. We have to add it as an entry component because you're not nowhere we are mentioning it in the HTML. It is gonna come in dynamically into picture. So for that reason, we have to include it as an entry component in the module. Okay, now our dialog works. So as I click on this, we get this dialog header. Let us go to dialog component. Okay, okay, now we have a working dialog. So when you click on this, this uses Angular's application reference to attach the view. So in order to attach the view, first we use the component resolve component factory to get a component reference or the component holder. Then by that we use the create method to get the instance of the component. From the instance we take the host view that we attach to the an app reference so that it comes under the Angular tree, that the detection cycle. Then we attach the view to the body. So all these are good. So now we will make our dialog to take dynamic content. Let us see how to do that. So let's go back to the dialog. Here in place of this body, it should take the dynamic content. Let us create an ng template for that first. And we would make a directive. Let us call this dialog content. So this is an attribute directive. So let us go ahead and create a component called dialog.directive.ts. Now we are going to import directive class from Angular core. I'm going to use the directive decorator to create a directive. Directive needs only selector and it should match with the name what we have given there. So we will give dialog hyphen content. This would be a exported class dialog directive. Let us have a constructor. So here we need a content view reference. We need a view container reference, sorry. We're gonna make an instance of that. Yep, so now we have the dialog. Why do we have this dialog? So that we can access this ng template dynamically in our component. Now in the dialog component, we can create a view child. This would be dialog directive, and let us import this. And let us name it as content, which is of type dialog directive. All right, now that we have these data, let us implement a onInit method for this, which is again from Angular core. This would implement onInit. Any lifecycle hook, we have to add the ng prefix to it. So when this component gets initialized, we are gonna read this content or take the content and place it inside this particular content. So in order to do that, we would again need a component factory resolver here. So let us put it in place, component factory resolver. Let us declare a variable called component fact resolver. All right, so before doing these things, now we have to, before going further, we will create a component which we can pass it to this particular dialog. So in the app level, let us create a user component. So under user, we will have user.component.ts file and okay, for now only ts file is enough. Let us import the component directive from Angular. Now using the decorator, I can create a component, and the selector for this would be user, and the template here we're going to give the template, not template URL. So we're going to say this is from user component. Export class user. Let us have a constructor. Okay, constructor is not necessary, so it's just a template. That's it. So now we have to pass this user as a dynamic content. Anything that is dynamic should be an entry component. For that reason, we'll include it here, and also we'll include it in the import. All right, user is not part of ng module, and we have to declare it as well. Any component should be part of any particular module. It can't be just roaming around here and there. So now our code still works, which is good. Let us go ahead and pass this component when we create the call. So when we open the dialog in the component, let us pass that particular component from here. So we're going to import user from the user folder. Now we can pass this user component, but our create method does not take it. So let us go ahead and accept a component here as comp. Now we should be getting rid of this error here. Yes, cool. Now that we have the component, this we have to pass it to the directive, sorry, to the dialog, so that there we can create an instance of this and bind it inside that. In order to do that, once we get the component reference, as I told, we get access to the instance of the component. So in this, we can access any method we want or any data we want. So we're going to have a method called setup. So for this method, we are going to pass this component. Since we don't have a setup method, let us go ahead and create that very quick. So we have a setup method which accepts the component. So in here, since we have the component, now we can create a component reference out of it. How do we do that? Same way, we would use component factor resolver to resolve this component. And okay, let us do one thing. Let us just take the value of component into a local variable called content. So let us go ahead and create a variable called content. Then once, okay, since we already have a variable content, it's giving an error. Let us just rename it to content holder, and we are going to create the content here. All right. And once it initializes, we're going to create the component reference out of this content. Now that we have this content, we can create the instance out of it. In order to do that, we can go to the component holder and create and call the create component. Wait a minute, we have to call it on the view container reference. This is what we have defined in here as a private injector. So view container reference, let me just cross check with the name. Yeah, and we're going to create the component by passing this component reference. So now we have the instance of this view container reference in this place. Okay, now if you see it's giving error, let us see, is it private and only accessible within the class. So let us go ahead and make it public so that it's accessible outside as well. All right, now we are good. So this creates a component and it attaches to this particular. All right, now so going further, we can take the make these headers dynamic rather than a static header. So we would assume this is something that we would receive from the setup. Let us receive it as a config object, and we would also receive the service instance. Let us first go ahead and pass this data. And we will pass a configuration object, which is again passed from the create method. And we have to pass the instance of this service because we can't put it as a direct dependency here. That means we can't create a private dialog service here because that goes for a cyclic dependency. That means whenever this component gets initialized, it is depending on the dialog service, and whenever dialog service is getting initialized, it would depend on the dialog component, so it would never resolve. It would go into a Stack Overflow. That is the reason we'll go ahead and just pass it as a reference. So now we have this value here. So config would be this dot config will be equal to config this dot dialog service is equal to service. Let us declare these two real quick. All right, now we have these instances. Let us try to open the dialog. We're getting error view container reference of undefined. Okay, that means this particular content holder is not getting defined. Why this would not be getting defined? This is a dialog directive. Let us go to HTML and okay, yeah, here is a spelling mistake. This should be dialog content. Let us try now. Okay, this is still an error. Dialog content. Let me just cross check this with the name here. This is same. A dialog. Okay, yeah, I got it. We have to use this as a attribute directive. So we have to append this within the angular brackets. Let us give it a try now. Still we are getting an error. Okay, so where this could have gone wrong. We have the redirect directive. Okay, let us see. Oh yeah, we have not declared it here. So let us declare the dialog directive as well. Import dialog directive from respective path dialog slash dialog dot directive. Let us give it a try now. Oh, we have our content and it is opening. This is from user component. which is from this user component. Let us pass the header in this. So along with user, we're going to pass a configuration object, which is going to take header. This is test header. And let us give a try. Okay, the header did not bind for some reason. Let us go and inspect that. Dialog directive, dialog service, we pass the config object, and in the dialog component, we have the config object directly assigned, and we never assign the header value. Let us directly assign the header value as well, or else by default we can define this config as a general object. No, let us just go ahead and define this header. And we do not need this config object for right now. Let us give it a try now. Yep, we have a test header heading from that component, and we also have this user component. Now this is draggable. If you click one more dialog, it creates one more. So we can create as many as we want. So what is happening here is it is creating the dialog on the run dynamically and attaching these things to the DOM's body tags. I mean, it is just appending to the body. So these all get appended, and we are putting it in the preferences attach view so that any changes this component goes through will be triggered. Let us just ensure that this component does some changes, and to do that, let us create a counter in here, which is of type number, which is initialized to 1. And let us have a constructor here. In the constructor, let us create an interval, which is a function which simply increments the counter value for every 1 second. And we will attach this counter value in the header. So now we run, sorry, in the body. Now if you see, this is incrementing. Now if I open a new component, let's say after 10 seconds, this will open a separate component and its instance runs from there. Now I'm going to open a third one. It opens and it runs on its own. So we have 3 different components, and all their instances are different, and all are being monitored by Angular. That means changes are being rendered immediately. So we have these things working. Now we have to implement close feature for this. Let us go to dialog service. Let us add a close method. This close method, we have to take a particular component. So how do we know that which component we are going to use now? So in order to differentiate that, in the component reference, in the instance, let's give a unique name for the component, or let us call it an ID. And in order to have this ID, let us create a counter here as well. This is again would be of type number, and it would be equal to 1. So here, now this ID would be dialog plus this dot counter incremented value. Okay, so that it every time it keeps adding. Now we don't have an ID here. Let us go ahead and create an ID. Now we have an ID. Now we have these many dialogues being opened, so we have to keep a track of it, or we have to store all these details. So for that, let us create a dialogues array, which would be an empty array. So as soon as we create this instance, let us push it to the dialog array. You know what? Let us create it as an object so that we can use hash table technology. So this would be dialog of this ID, same ID we're going to use so that we can reuse it. So let us quickly create a constants ID and we will assign this ID to that. So using the same ID, we are going to create an object which has component reference. I will tell you why we need this component reference, because we have to destroy this component whenever we close it. So for that reason, we are making use of the component reference because the method is available in this. And we are going to take the host view. We need this to in order to detach it. So this holds, let us name it as host view. This would be this dot. Yep. Now that we have these details, now let us assume our close method accepts an ID. So this dot dialogs of ID, if this is present, we are gonna call dialogs of ID dot component reference dot destroy. So this will destroy the component. Also, we want to detach this particular component from the DOM. So we would say when you destroy it, automatically it would remove from the DOM. So here we will say this dot app reference dot detach view will be dialogs IDs host view. Now let us call this method, and we have an error here. Let us see what it is. Okay, we have an extra bracket. Let us call this method from here. So we have this close, which would call the dialog service dot close, for which we will pass ID of this particular component. Now we have to call this close. So in the header, I'm adding a span. I'm going to hardcode a style here. Giving an X. And I'm going to write a click event which would call the close method. So when you click on open dialog, it opens, and when we click on the close, it closes. So we have two close methods, which is the default prime ng close. Let us just get rid of that. We would have closable initialized to false. It would be a property. Here we have a spelling mistake. It's closable equals to false, and now we have only one. Yep, then it closes. Let us quickly add a cursor pointer. So we have 1, 2, 3 components. This is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. All the things are running separately, and if I remove all of them, gets removed individually. Now if you want a callback function for these, all those can be added here. So in the close, we can define a onClose method, which you can pass it to the component, that is the calling component, which is this open dialog. So you can do further changes in this. Hope this would have helped a little bit. Thank you for watching.